What if everything you were taught about desire, relationships, attraction, and even success was only part of the story? What if the way you experience intimacy is shaped not only by biology, but by your emotions, your memories, your culture, your expectations, your relationships, and the stories you tell yourself? And what if the same psychology influencing your relationships is also influencing the way you spend money, respond to fear, handle rejection, and make decisions about your future? Human sexuality is not simply about desire. It is about choice, communication, identity, boundaries, vulnerability, and the complicated psychology of being human. Sometimes an emotion is powerful, but that does not mean it should control your behavior. Sometimes attraction is real, but it does not create entitlement. Sometimes rejection hurts, but it does not define your worth. Sometimes a relationship changes, but change does not automatically mean failure. And sometimes the life you are chasing is not even the life you truly wanted, is simply the life society taught you to pursue. The same principle applies to money. Financial freedom is not about owning everything you desire. It is about creating enough resilience and choice that you are not trapped by every unexpected expense, social expectation, or impulsive decision. It is learning to pause before reacting, to question before believing, and to choose long-term freedom over short-term approval. You do not need to know everything. You need to remain curious. You need the courage to question assumptions, the humility to admit when you are wrong, and the discipline to turn knowledge into action, because your body is not your worth. Your relationship status is not your worth. Your income is not your worth. Your past is not your destiny. Your story is still being written, and the next decision is yours. Imagine sitting in a room filled with people and asking a question that seems simple on the surface. What does it mean to be a sexual human being? You might expect a quick answer. Perhaps someone would mention attraction, relationships, desire, reproduction, intimacy, or pleasure. But the longer you think about the question, the more complicated it becomes. Human sexuality is not a single behavior, and it is not a switch that is either turned on or turned off. It is woven through our emotions, our bodies, our memories, our relationships, our culture, our expectations, our experiences, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Two people can stand in the same room, encounter the same situation, and experience it in completely different ways because each person carries a different psychological history. That is what makes human sexuality so fascinating. It is not simply about what people do. It is about what people feel, imagine, desire, fear, interpret, communicate, and choose. When I think about sexuality, I want to begin by moving away from one of the most common mistakes we make, assuming that there is one universal human experience. We often speak about sexuality as though everyone should develop in the same way, experience attraction in the same way, want the same things, and move through relationships according to the same timetable. But human beings are remarkably diverse. Desire can be intense or subtle. Attraction can change across time. Some people prioritize romantic connection, others place greater emphasis on sexual connection, and still others experience their relationships and identities in ways that do not fit traditional categories. Even within the same identity group, individual experiences can vary enormously. Diversity does not mean that psychology has nothing useful to tell us. It means that psychological science becomes more valuable when we use it to understand patterns without pretending that every individual is identical. One of the most important questions we can ask is, where our ideas about sexuality come from. We are not born knowing what a relationship is supposed to look like. We learn from parents, friends, schools, religion, entertainment, social media, communities, and personal experience. Some lessons are helpful, others are incomplete. Some are based on evidence, others are based on myths that have simply been repeated for generations. By adulthood, many people carry assumptions they have never consciously examined. They may believe that men and women are naturally supposed to behave in completely different ways. They may believe that jealousy is proof of love, They may believe that attraction should always remain intense in a successful relationship. They may believe that a particular body type is universally desirable. They may believe that everyone experiences sexual desire in the same way. And because these assumptions are familiar, they can feel like facts, but familiarity is not evidence. That is why one of the most useful questions you can ask about any claim concerning sexuality is, how do we know? If someone makes a dramatic statement about what all men want, ask how that conclusion was reached. If someone claims that every woman behaves a certain way, ask what evidence supports the claim. If an advertisement tells you that a product will transform your desirability, ask what problem the advertisement is creating before it offers to sell you the solution. If a social media personality tells you that one secret guarantees relationship success, be cautious. Human behavior rarely fits neatly into one secret formula. A useful motivational principle is this: curiosity is stronger than assumption because curiosity leaves room for reality to surprise you. That principle can change the way you approach relationships. Instead of assuming you know what another person feels, ask. Instead of deciding that a partner's silence means rejection, explore the possibilities. Instead of assuming a friend understands your expectations, communicate them. Instead of expecting someone to read your mind, give them information they can actually respond to. Communication does not guarantee that two people will agree, but it gives them a chance to understand one another. And understanding matters because sexual relationships are not simply physical interactions. They involve psychological meaning. A touch can communicate affection. A conversation can communicate reassurance. A boundary can communicate personal needs. A lack of communication can create uncertainty. The same behavior can have completely different meanings depending on the relationship between the people involved, their expectations, and their emotional context. This is why reducing sexuality to a list of behaviors misses so much of what makes it psychologically important. Consider attraction. We sometimes talk about attraction as if it were a mathematical equation. Certain physical characteristics are presented as universally desirable, and people are encouraged to believe that if they possess those characteristics, attraction will automatically follow. But attraction is influenced by much more than appearance. Context matters. Familiarity can matter. Personality can matter. Similarity can matter. Social expectations can matter. Emotional connection can matter. Individual experiences can matter. Cultural standards can matter. Even our own psychological state can influence what we notice and what we find appealing. This is one reason comparisons can become so destructive. A person may look at carefully selected images online and begin comparing their everyday appearance with someone else's most polished presentation. Eventually, they may stop asking, "Am I healthy?" and start asking, "Am I attractive enough?" Those are not the same question. Health is multidimensional. Appearance is influenced by culture and personal preference, and self-worth cannot be reduced to physical attractiveness. When people constantly compare themselves with idealized images, their perception of normality can become distorted. The ordinary human body may begin to seem inadequate simply because it is being compared with an extraordinary or carefully edited presentation. This is not merely an aesthetic issue. It can influence confidence, relationships, sexual satisfaction, and the way people perceive their own desirability. So I want to offer you another principle. Never measure your entire life against someone else's carefully selected moment. That principle applies to sexuality, but it also applies to money. Financial freedom begins with understanding the difference between reality and presentation. Someone may display an expensive car, luxurious vacation, designer clothing, or beautiful home online, but you do not know the financial structure behind the image. Perhaps they own those things outright. Perhaps they are deeply in debt. Perhaps they are promoting a business. Perhaps the image is staged. Perhaps the person is sacrificing financial security to maintain the appearance of success. The appearance of wealth and the experience of financial freedom are not identical. Financial freedom is fundamentally about choice. It is about having enough financial resilience that your decisions are not controlled entirely by immediate financial pressure. It may mean building savings, reducing expensive debt, developing valuable skills, investing appropriately for your circumstances, managing risk, and resisting unnecessary lifestyle inflation. The goal is not to become obsessed with money. The goal is to make money serve your life rather than allowing your entire life to serve money. And this is where psychology becomes relevant to finance. Human beings do not always make financial decisions rationally. We are influenced by emotion, social comparison, immediate rewards, fear, excitement, status, and the desire to belong. The same psychological forces that influence relationships can influence spending. We may buy something because we want to feel attractive. We may spend because we want social approval. We may pursue an investment because everyone around us appears to be making money. We may avoid looking at our bank account because the information creates anxiety. Avoidance feels comfortable in the short term, but avoidance has a cost. If you never examine your financial situation, you cannot manage it effectively. If you never discuss financial expectations with a partner, misunderstandings can grow. If you never learn basic financial principles, you become more dependent on other people's advice. And if you allow embarrassment to prevent you from asking questions, you may remain confused for years. The same principle applies to sexual health. Embarrassment can prevent people from seeking reliable information. They may feel uncomfortable discussing concerns with a healthcare professional. They may turn to anonymous internet searches and receive frightening or inaccurate answers. They may allow myths to guide decisions that deserve evidence. Knowledge is a form of protection, but knowledge must be credible. Not every confident person is an expert. Not every popular claim is supported by research. Not every personal story represents a general rule, and not every piece of health information applies equally to every individual. When the stakes are high, learn from reliable sources and seek appropriate professional guidance. There is tremendous value in understanding the difference between information and evidence. Information is everywhere. Evidence requires evaluation. A person can tell you what happened to them, and their experience may be completely genuine, but a personal story cannot automatically establish a universal rule. One person's relationship success does not prove that their strategy works for everyone. One person's health experience does not establish a medical fact. One person's investment success does not prove that an opportunity is appropriate for you. We need both curiosity and skepticism. Curiosity helps us learn. Skepticism helps us avoid being misled. Together, they create better judgment, and judgment becomes particularly important when we discuss sexual fantasies. Many people become frightened by the fact that they experience fantasies that they would never want to act upon. They may interpret the existence of a thought as evidence that something is wrong with them, but thoughts, fantasies, intentions, and behaviors are not identical. The human imagination is capable of exploring countless scenarios. A fantasy can represent curiosity, novelty, symbolism, emotional themes, or simply imaginative stimulation. Having a thought does not automatically mean that you want to make it reality. The important distinction is between imagination and behavior, and between private fantasy and ethical action. In real relationships, other people are characters in our imagination. They are autonomous human beings with their own wishes, boundaries, and choices. What someone imagines privately does not give them permission to impose that fantasy on another person. Ethical sexuality requires respect for autonomy and meaningful consent. That principle is simple, but its implications are profound. Attraction does not create entitlement. Desire does not create permission. Commitment does not eliminate boundaries. And love does not mean ownership. A healthy relationship allows two people to remain individuals while creating meaningful connection. Each person brings their own history, personality, needs, and preferences. The goal is not to erase those differences. The goal is to understand them well enough to build a relationship that respects both people. This is why communication about sex can be so important. People sometimes assume that discussing sexual preferences will make intimacy less spontaneous. In reality, thoughtful communication can create greater understanding. When people can express what they enjoy, what they dislike, what they are uncertain about, and what their boundaries are, they reduce the need for guessing. Communication can also help people recognize that desire is not always static. What someone wants can change depending on mood, health, stress, relationship circumstances, and many other factors. There is nothing inherently wrong with change. A person can want something today and not want it tomorrow. A person can feel desire strongly one stage of life and differently at another. A couple can experience periods of intense sexual activity and periods in which other priorities become more important. The goal is not to force human sexuality into a fixed timetable. The goal is to understand the person and the circumstances. That is why I encourage you to replace the question, "Is this normal?" with a more useful set of questions. Is this healthy? For me, is it consensual? Is it consistent with my values? Is everyone involved able to make informed choices? Is anyone being harmed or pressured? Do I have reliable information? Those questions are more useful than chasing an imaginary universal standard. Normality is often misunderstood. Something can be statistically common without being morally required. Something can be less common without being unhealthy. Human diversity means that frequency alone cannot answer every question. This is also why stigma can be so damaging. When people are taught that certain thoughts, identities, or experiences make them fundamentally defective, they may become afraid to seek help. Shame encourages secrecy. Secrecy can prevent communication. Lack of communication can prevent appropriate support. Compassion does not mean ignoring harmful behavior. It means separating the person from the opportunity to learn. A person can be accountable and still deserve dignity. A person can make a mistake and still be capable of growth. A person can discover something about themselves that challenges what they previously believed and still deserve respect. Growth often begins when we stop treating uncertainty as a personal failure. You do not need to have every answer about yourself immediately. Self-understanding is a process. As you grow older, your experiences change. Your relationships change. Your responsibilities change. Your body changes. Your priorities change. What mattered enormously at 20 may not matter in the same way at 40. Something you feared when you were younger may become easier to navigate later. That does not mean your earlier self was foolish. It means you developed, and development is not something we should fear. It is something we should understand. This brings us to another financial principle. Do not confuse where you are with where you are going. Your current financial situation is a starting point, not necessarily a permanent identity. Perhaps you are carrying debt. Perhaps you have little saved. Perhaps you are just beginning to understand investing. Perhaps your income is limited. The first step is not shame. It is clarity. Know what you earn. Know what you spend. Know what you owe. Know what you own. Know what you are trying to accomplish. Then make decisions based on reality. The same principle applies psychologically. Know what you feel. Know what you value. Know your boundaries. Know your patterns. Know where you need help. Clarity comes before strategy. You cannot create a meaningful plan around information you refuse to examine. And sometimes clarity hurts. You may discover that a relationship is not meeting your needs. You may discover that your spending habits are undermining your goals. You may discover that a belief you inherited does not match the evidence. You may discover that you have been trying to impress people who are not actually paying attention. You may discover that your fear has been making decisions for you. That realization can be uncomfortable, but discomfort is not always a warning that you are doing something wrong. Sometimes discomfort is evidence that you are finally looking honestly at something important. So do not run from every uncomfortable truth. Some truths are doors. They show you where change can begin, and change does not have to happen all at once. One honest conversation can begin repairing a relationship. One financial review can begin rebuilding stability. One appointment can address a health concern. One book can challenge an assumption. One boundary can change the direction of an interaction. One decision to stop comparing yourself with unrealistic images can change the way you experience your own body. Small decisions compound. That is true financially. It is true psychologically. It is true relationally. If you repeatedly practice honesty, honesty becomes easier. If you repeatedly practice listening, listening becomes more natural. If you repeatedly save, saving becomes part of your financial identity. If you repeatedly examine evidence, critical thinking becomes stronger. If you repeatedly respect boundaries, ethical behavior becomes habitual. This is why I would never tell you that transformation requires one extraordinary moment. Transformation often comes from ordinary moments, repeated with intention. Your future is being shaped by those ordinary moments right now. So as you think about your sexuality, your relationships, your health, your finances, and your future, do not ask only what society expects from you. Ask what kind of person you want to become. Do you want to become someone who communicates honestly, someone who respects autonomy, someone who can tolerate differences, someone who makes financial decisions thoughtfully, someone who seeks evidence rather than rumors, someone who can admit, I don't know, someone who can say, I need help, someone who can say no without cruelty and yes without pressure, someone who can experience desire without confusing desire with entitlement, someone who can build intimacy without losing individuality, someone who can pursue financial security without making money the measure of worth. Those are deeper goals than simply appearing successful. And perhaps the most important principle is this: build a life that gives you more choices, not merely a life that gives you more things. That principle can guide your relationships. It can guide your sexuality. It can guide your finances. It can guide your education. When you learn more, you have more choices. When you manage money responsibly, you may have more choices. When you understand your boundaries, you have more choices. When you develop communication skills, you have more choices. When you take care of your health, you may preserve more choices for your future. Freedom is not created by having every possible option. It is created by having meaningful options and the wisdom to choose among them. And that wisdom begins with understanding yourself. Not the version of yourself that social media displays. Not the version your family expects. Not the version your partner wants you to be. Not the version advertisers want to sell to you. The complicated, evolving, imperfect human being who is still learning. That is where the real journey begins. There is a moment in many relationships when the excitement of discovery gives way to something deeper. At first, everything can feel effortless. A glance becomes a conversation becomes anticipation, and anticipation becomes the feeling that you have somehow found someone who understands you. But then real life arrives. Work becomes stressful. Responsibilities multiply. Familiarity replaces novelty. To people who once seemed perfectly synchronized, discover that they have different expectations, different levels of desire, different ways of expressing affection, and different ideas about what a satisfying relationship should look like. This is not necessarily evidence that something has gone wrong. It may simply be evidence that attraction is only the beginning of a much larger psychological story. Research on sexuality and relationships emphasizes that human sexual expression varies across people, relationships, and stages of life, and that context can profoundly influence what sexuality means to an individual. One of the most fascinating things about desire is that it does not exist in isolation. The mind and body are constantly interacting with one another. Emotions, stress, previous experiences, body image, relationship circumstances, and learning can all influence sexual desire. Biological factors matter, but psychology matters too. The book's discussion of sexual response emphasizes that desire is influenced by psychological factors as well as biological ones, and it also points out that desire does not always have to come first. For some people, Desire can emerge after sexual activity or intimacy has already begun. That observation is important because it challenges the expectation that healthy sexuality must always begin with an intense spontaneous feeling. Human beings do not all operate according to the same internal timetable. Think about how often people compare their relationships with an imaginary standard. They watch movies in which attraction never fades. They see couples online who appear permanently passionate. They hear stories about how often other people supposedly have sex. Then they look at their own relationship and wonder, what's wrong with us? But comparison can create a problem where none existed. A relationship can be affectionate, intimate, supportive, and satisfying without resembling someone else's relationship. Quality cannot always be measured by frequency, appearance, or public displays of romance. The same lesson applies to financial life. People often compare their bank accounts, homes, careers, vacations, and possessions with what they see around them. But financial circumstances are deeply personal. Someone else's spending pattern may not fit your goals. Someone else's income may come with responsibilities you cannot see. Someone else's apparent success may depend on debt, family wealth, or circumstances that are completely different from yours. The financially intelligent question is not, how do I look compared with them? It is, am I moving toward the future I actually want? That distinction is powerful because comparison turns life into a competition, while purpose turns life into a direction. A useful principle is, measure progress against your values, not against someone else's highlight reel. If your goal is financial freedom, perhaps your next step is not buying something that signals success. Perhaps it is creating an emergency reserve, reducing expensive debt, learning how investing works, or increasing your earning potential through education and skills. The point is not deprivation. The point is intentionality. Spend money in what genuinely improves your life, but do not allow social comparison to become the invisible manager of your finances. The psychology of relationships works in much the same way. Attraction can bring people together, but maintaining a relationship requires skills. Communication is one of them. People sometimes imagine that if two people are truly compatible, communication should happen naturally. Yet even people who love one another can misunderstand each other. They may interpret the same behavior differently. They may have different expectations about affection, commitment, privacy, money, household responsibilities, or sexual activity. Without communication, assumptions begin doing the work that conversation should have done. And assumptions are dangerous because they feel like facts. One partner thinks, if they loved me, they would know what I need. The other thinks, if they needed something, they would tell me. Both people may be waiting for the other to act. Nothing happens. Then disappointment grows. The solution is not mind reading. The solution is communication. Say what you need. Ask what the other person needs. Listen to the answer. And remember that listening does not mean agreeing with everything you hear. It means giving the other person enough attention to understand what they are actually saying before deciding how you will respond. Sexual communication can be especially important because people may carry embarrassment, uncertainty, or fear of rejection into intimate conversations. Someone might be afraid to say what they enjoy. Another person might hesitate to mention a concern about sexual health. A couple might avoid discussing differences in desire because they fear that the conversation itself will make the problem worse. Yet research discussed in the book indicates that communication about sex can be associated with greater sexual satisfaction. Communication does not have to be dramatic. Sometimes it begins with a simple question. How are you feeling about us? Is there anything you've been hesitant to tell me? Is there something you'd like more of? Is there anything you would rather not do? Do you feel comfortable? Those questions create space. And space matters. A person cannot be truly known if they are never given permission to speak honestly. This is also where consent becomes more than a word. Consent is connected to autonomy, the ability of people to make decisions about themselves. Desire cannot replace consent. Attraction cannot replace consent. A previous agreement cannot automatically replace present communication. and the existence of a relationship does not eliminate a person's right to establish boundaries. That principle should be obvious, but human psychology can complicate it. People sometimes interpret rejection personally. They may hear no and translate it into "you are undesirable." They may hear "not tonight" and interpret it as "you are no longer loved." But another person's boundary is information about their present choice. It is not automatically a verdict on your worth. Learning to separate rejection from identity is a powerful emotional skill. Someone can decline an invitation without declaring that you are worthless. A partner can have a different level of desire without proving that you are unattractive. Someone can end a relationship without erasing the value of the time you shared. A person can disagree with you without becoming your enemy. The mature response is to gather information before creating a story. This matters because the human mind is constantly trying to fill gaps. When information is incomplete, we create explanations. Sometimes those explanations are accurate, sometimes they are not. If a partner takes longer than usual to respond to a message, your mind might immediately create a story. "They're angry with me." Another possibility is that they are working, exhausted, distracted, or dealing with something unrelated to you. The psychological lesson is simple. A feeling can tell you that something matters without telling you exactly what happened. That is why emotional awareness and evidence should work together. Notice the feeling, then investigate the facts. This is useful in sexuality and finance alike. If you feel anxious about your relationship, do not automatically conclude that the relationship is failing. If you feel anxious about money, do not automatically conclude that you are financially doomed. Look at the evidence. What is actually happening? What do you know? What are you assuming? What information is missing? What action would improve the situation? These questions move you from emotional reaction toward intentional decision-making. Human sexuality also reminds us that there is tremendous diversity in how people form relationships. Some people seek long-term romantic partnerships. Some prefer to remain single. Some people form relationships that are highly traditional, while others create arrangements that differ from conventional expectations. The book explores multiple relationship forms, including friendships with sexual components, passionate and companionate love, and relationships that challenge conventional assumptions. It also discusses how cultural context can influence relationships and marriage. That diversity does not mean that every relationship arrangement works for every person. It means that we should be careful about confusing different from me with wrong. A relationship should be evaluated in terms of factors such as mutual agreement, respect, communication, autonomy, and well-being rather than simply whether it resembles the relationship model we grew up seeing. Culture has enormous influence here. The meaning of marriage, partnership, gender roles, and intimacy varies across societies. The book notes that marriage serves different purposes in different cultural contexts and that people in different societies may approach partner selection in very different ways. Interestingly, research discussed there found that people in arranged marriages in India and people in marriages based on personal choice in the United States did not necessarily differ in marital satisfaction. The broader lesson is not that one system is superior. It is that human relationships cannot always be understood through a single cultural lens. Your definition of a successful relationship may have been inherited. Examine it. Maybe your family taught you that love means constant togetherness. Maybe another family taught someone else that independence is essential. Maybe one culture places strong emphasis on family involvement, another may emphasize individual choice. Neither observation tells us what every individual must want. People are more complicated than cultural stereotypes, and the same is true of gender. Sexual psychology has historically been filled with claims about how men and women supposedly differ. Some differences have empirical support in particular contexts. Others have been exaggerated, oversimplified, or treated as universal when they are not. One of the most useful habits you can develop is to distinguish between an average difference observed in a study and a rule that applies to every individual. An average is not a destiny. If a study finds that two groups differ on average, that does not mean every person in one group behaves differently from every person in the other. Human beings overlap. Individuals vary. Context matters, and social expectations can influence behavior themselves. This is particularly important when we discuss sexual desire and casual relationships. Popular culture often portrays men and women as having dramatically different levels of interest in casual sex, but research summarized in the book complicates that stereotype. In some situations, the traditional difference in sexual selectivity can disappear, particularly when the social context changes, such as when women are the ones approaching men. The lesson is not that men and women are identical. The lesson is that behavior cannot always be explained by biology alone. Social roles matter. Opportunity matters. Expectations matter. Who initiates matters. Context matters. That is why simplistic explanations are often inadequate. When you hear someone say, "Men are just like this," or "Women always want that," pause. Ask what evidence supports the claim. Ask whether the research examined actual behavior or merely people's stated ideals. Ask whether the sample represented diverse populations. Ask whether culture might have influenced the findings. This habit of questioning can protect you from stereotypes and improve your ability to understand people. And it can protect your money too. Financial marketing frequently relies on broad psychological assumptions. Everyone is buying this. Smart people are investing here. You don't want to miss out. Successful people use this strategy. These messages attempt to create a social identity around a financial decision, but your financial plan should not be determined by your desire to belong. The same person who tells you that everyone is making money from an opportunity may not be the person who will absorb your losses. You are responsible for your decisions. Learn before you commit. Understand the risk. Know the fees. Consider your time horizon. Avoid putting money into something you do not understand simply because someone speaks confidently. Financial freedom requires the ability to delay gratification, and that psychological skill is connected to many areas of life. If you can tolerate waiting, you can save. If you can tolerate uncertainty, you can gather information. If you can tolerate temporary disappointment, you can maintain a boundary. If you can tolerate not being universally liked, you can make choices consistent with your values. Patience is not passive. Patience is the ability to resist an immediate reaction in service of a longer-term goal. A financial principle worth remembering is, do not sacrifice long-term freedom for short-term applause. You do not need to purchase something because everyone else has it. You do not need to maintain an expensive lifestyle because you fear appearing unsuccessful. You do not need to chase every investment trend. You do not need to prove your worth through consumption. Your money can purchase things, but its greatest value may be the choices it creates. Money can provide time. Money can provide flexibility. Money can provide a buffer against emergencies. Money can allow you to invest in education. Money can help you leave situations that are financially or personally harmful. That is why financial freedom is not really about luxury. It is about agency. And agency is equally important in sexuality. A person should be able to make decisions about their intimate life without coercion. They should have access to accurate information. They should understand relevant health risks. They should be able to communicate boundaries. They should have the ability to say yes or no without being threatened or manipulated. Freedom requires informed choice. Without information, choice can be severely limited. Without consent, choice can be violated. Without financial resilience, choice can be constrained. Without emotional skills, choice can be distorted by fear. The different dimensions of freedom reinforce one another. This is why education matters. When you understand your own psychology, you become less vulnerable to manipulation. When you understand relationships, you can recognize unhealthy patterns earlier. When you understand financial principles, you can evaluate opportunities more carefully. When you understand health information, you can make better decisions about care. Knowledge does not guarantee perfect decisions, but ignorance removes options. And perhaps one of the most important things we can learn about sexuality is that our internal experiences do not always follow the stories society tells us. Sexual fantasies are a powerful example. Fantasies are common, and research suggests that they can serve different psychological purposes. A fantasy is not automatically a plan. An imagined scenario does not necessarily represent a person's values, intentions, or desired real-world behavior. The imagination is a laboratory. It can explore possibilities without requiring us to enact them. This distinction can relieve unnecessary shame, while still leaving room for ethical responsibility. What matters in the real world is how we treat other people. Fantasies do not give us permission to violate another person's boundaries. The psychological world and the behavioral world overlap, but they are not identical. That distinction is important in many areas beyond sexuality. You can imagine spending $1 million without actually spending it. You can imagine quitting your job without actually quitting. You can imagine confronting someone without actually confronting them. The mind can simulate possibilities before behavior occurs. Sometimes imagination can even help us discover what we value. A fantasy about travel may reveal a desire for freedom. A fantasy about career success may reveal a desire for recognition. A fantasy about intimacy may reveal a desire for emotional connection. But interpretation requires caution. Not every imagined scenario has a hidden message. Sometimes a thought is simply a thought. This is another reason not to pathologize every difference. A behavior or experience becomes a significant problem in psychological contexts based partly on factors such as distress, impairment, or harm, not merely because it differs from someone else's preferences. The book's discussion of sexual difficulties emphasizes the importance of subjective distress and relationship impact when considering whether something should be regarded as a dysfunction. That is a valuable reminder. Difference is not automatically dysfunction. Unfamiliarity is not automatically pathology. And a statistic is not automatically a standard you must meet. Your responsibility is to understand yourself, protect your health, respect others, and seek help when something causes significant distress or interferes with the life or relationships you want. There is another lesson hidden inside this idea. Stop turning every difference into a crisis. A couple may have different levels of desire. That does not automatically mean the relationship is doomed. They may need communication, negotiation, affection, non-sexual intimacy, or professional support. A person may have periods of lower desire because of stress or life circumstances. That does not automatically mean something is permanently wrong. A person may experience attraction differently from what their family expected. That does not automatically mean their life is broken. The appropriate response is curiosity rather than panic. What is happening? What has changed? What does this person want? What is causing distress? What support would help? Those questions lead somewhere. Fear-based conclusions often do not. Relationships also change because people change. Someone who begins a relationship at one stage of life may later develop new goals. Career demands may change. Health may change. Family responsibilities may change. People age. Priorities evolve. A relationship that survives those changes is not necessarily one that never changes. It may be one in which the people inside it learn how to change together. That is why adaptability is an underrated relationship skill. Do not ask only, how do we keep things exactly the way they were? Ask, how do we remain connected as our lives evolve? That question is equally valuable. Financially, a financial plan that worked when you were 25 may not fit when you are 45. Your income may change. Your responsibilities may change. Your risk tolerance may change. Your family circumstances may change. Your goals may change. A good financial system should be reviewed and adjusted rather than treated as a permanent script. Flexibility is not failure. Adjustment is not. Inconsistency. Sometimes changing the plan is evidence that you are paying attention. The same applies to identity. You are allowed to discover new things about yourself. You are allowed to refine your values. You are allowed to learn that a relationship structure you once expected is not the one you want. You are allowed to decide that financial status matters less to you than time. You are allowed to realize that health, family, creativity, or community matters more than external achievement. The important question is whether the change is thoughtful rather than merely reactive. Pause. Reflect. Gather information. Then choose. That is mature freedom. And as you develop that freedom, remember that your decisions exist inside a social world. Other people's choices affect you, and your choices affect them. This is why respect cannot be an afterthought. A healthy society requires people who can disagree without dehumanizing one another, who can recognize diversity without assuming that every difference is a threat, and who can protect individual autonomy while taking responsibility for harm. Your sexuality is personal, but it is never completely separate from relationships and society. Your financial life is personal, but it is also shaped by family, institutions, economic conditions, education, and opportunity. Understanding context makes us more compassionate and more realistic. It reminds us that personal responsibility matters without pretending that circumstances do not, and perhaps that is the deeper purpose of studying human sexuality, not simply to learn more facts about sex, but to become better observers of human behavior, to recognize that people are influenced by biology, psychology, relationships, culture, learning, and circumstance, to become less certain when certainty is not justified, to become more compassionate without abandoning critical thinking, to become more responsible without becoming judgmental, because once you understand that human behavior is complicated, you can stop demanding simplistic explanations. You can ask better questions. And better questions create better decisions. So, when you think about attraction, do not ask only, why am I attracted to this person? Ask what experiences, expectations, emotions, and context may be influencing you. When you think about relationships, do not ask only, is this relationship normal? Ask, is this relationship respectful, consensual, healthy, and consistent with what both people genuinely want? When you think about money, do not ask only, how can I look successful? Ask, how can I build sustainable freedom? When you think about your future, do not ask only, what will impress other people? Ask, what will give my future self more choices? That is the shift from performance to purpose. And purpose is where freedom begins. There is another part of human sexuality that deserves our attention, because it reveals something fundamental about the human mind. We are not simply driven by desire. We are constantly interpreting desire. We ask ourselves what it means, whether it is acceptable, whether it makes us attractive, whether someone else feels the same way, whether a relationship is becoming more serious, whether we are being rejected, whether we are normal, and whether our experiences fit the expectations we were taught. In other words, sexuality is not merely something that happens to us. It is something we think about, and sometimes the stories we create around our experiences can become more influential than the experiences themselves. A person may receive a perfectly ordinary response from a partner and interpret it as rejection. Someone may experience a temporary change in desire and interpret it as proof that their relationship has failed. Another person may compare their body with an unrealistic cultural ideal and conclude that they are somehow unworthy of intimacy. The event may be small, but the meaning attached to it can become enormous. This is why psychological understanding matters. If you can learn to separate an experience from the story you immediately attach to it, you gain an extraordinary amount of freedom. Think about the word desire. We often talk about it as though it were a simple internal command. I want something, therefore I should pursue it. But desire is not the same thing as action. You can want something and still decide that pursuing it would not be wise. You can feel attracted to someone and still respect the boundaries of your relationship. You can experience curiosity without turning curiosity into behavior. You can feel angry and still choose not to hurt someone. You can want to spend money and still decide that the purchase would undermine a larger financial goal. Mature decision-making begins when we recognize that an impulse can provide information without becoming an instruction. Your emotions can tell you something matters. They do not always tell you what to do about it. That is one of the most valuable principles you can carry through life. Feelings deserve attention, but choices deserve judgment. When you understand this, you stop treating every emotion as a command. You can acknowledge desire without surrendering to it. You can acknowledge jealousy without becoming controlling. You can acknowledge fear without allowing fear to make every decision. You can acknowledge excitement without taking reckless risks. This is emotional freedom, not the absence of emotion, but the ability to experience emotion without automatically becoming its servant. The same principle is essential when thinking about sexual consent and boundaries. Consent is sometimes discussed as though it were merely a formal requirement, but psychologically it represents something much deeper. Recognition that another person has their own mind, preferences, limits, and agency. You cannot know another person's internal experience simply because you are attracted to them. You cannot assume that because someone agreed previously, they will always agree. You cannot assume that affection means unlimited access. And you cannot treat discomfort as an inconvenience that must be overcome. A respectful relationship allows people to communicate their boundaries without fearing punishment, humiliation, manipulation, or retaliation. That means healthy sexuality requires listening for more than the word yes. It requires paying attention to whether participation is genuinely voluntary and whether the person is comfortable expressing what they want. Communication should be an ongoing process rather than a single checkpoint. People can change their minds. Circumstances can change. Emotional states can change. Relationships can change. Respecting those changes is part of respecting the person. And there is a powerful connection here to financial freedom. Financial autonomy also means having the ability to make choices without inappropriate coercion. Imagine a person who remains in a damaging situation because they have no savings, no income of their own, or no realistic financial alternatives. Their financial circumstances can limit their practical freedom. That does not mean money solves every personal problem, but it does mean financial resilience can expand the range of choices available to a person. An emergency fund, manageable expenses, employable skills, and thoughtful financial planning can provide something that is difficult to measure on a spreadsheet. Breathing room. So here is a financial principle worth remembering. Financial freedom is not the freedom to buy everything. It is the freedom to avoid being trapped by what you cannot afford to lose. That is why I encourage you to think about money in terms of resilience rather than status. A large income can disappear quickly when expenses rise alongside it. A person can earn more and still feel financially trapped if every increase in income immediately becomes another increase in spending. Lifestyle inflation can quietly transform higher earnings into higher obligations. Suddenly, the person who thought they were becoming wealthier has simply become more expensive to maintain. The solution is not to reject pleasure. Pleasure is part of life. The solution is to make pleasure intentional. Spend on things that genuinely align with your priorities. Be cautious about spending designed primarily to impress people. Learn the difference between an expense that provides lasting value and an expense that provides a brief emotional high followed by another payment. Sometimes the best purchase is an experience. Sometimes it is education. Sometimes it is convenience. Sometimes it is simply something that brings you joy. But if you spend automatically whenever you feel insecure, bored, stressed, or socially pressured, your emotions are quietly controlling your finances. Advertising understands this psychology extremely well. It rarely says, "Here is an object with certain practical features." Instead, it may say, "Here is the person you could become if you own this object." The product becomes associated with attractiveness, confidence, youth, success, belonging, freedom, or desirability. Once you recognize that strategy, you can pause before purchasing and ask, "Do I actually want this item? or do I want the identity being sold alongside it? That question can save you money. It can also save you from chasing an impossible ideal. The same phenomenon occurs with sexual attractiveness. Entire industries benefit when people believe their bodies are inadequate. A person is shown an idealized image and encouraged to think, I need to change myself before I can be desirable. But the human body is not a product manufactured according to one universal specification. People vary enormously. What one person finds attractive may not appeal to another. Cultural standards change. Personal preferences differ. And physical appearance is only one component of attraction and intimacy. The more you understand this, the less vulnerable you become to manipulation through insecurity. Your body is not a financial asset whose value rises and falls according to public opinion. Your worth is not a market price. You do not become more valuable because strangers approve of your appearance, and you do not become less valuable because someone does not find you attractive. This is particularly important because rejection can activate powerful emotions. Humans are social creatures, and exclusion can feel threatening. When someone rejects us romantically or sexually, the mind may interpret that event as a judgment on the entire self. But rejection is usually more specific than that. A person may not be interested because of timing, compatibility, circumstances, personal preference, another relationship, or countless factors that have little to do with your overall worth. Rejection can hurt, but pain does not mean the rejection was unjust, and rejection does not require revenge, humiliation, or self-destruction. Sometimes the healthiest response is simply to accept the information and move forward. That is difficult because the human mind often wants closure. We want to know exactly why someone did not choose us. We replay conversations. We analyze messages. We search for clues. We imagine alternate outcomes. But sometimes there is no explanation that will make the situation feel completely satisfying. There is only acceptance. Acceptance is not surrender. Acceptance means recognizing reality so that you can decide what to do next. That principle is useful in financial life as well. Perhaps you made a poor investment. Perhaps you accumulated debt. Perhaps you delayed saving. Perhaps you made a career decision that did not work. You can spend years wishing the past had been different. Or you can study what happened and make a better decision now. You cannot invest your way backward in time. You cannot save yesterday's money. You cannot change an old relationship by endlessly replaying it, but you can use the present. That is where your power exists. One of the most destructive psychological habits is allowing an old decision to justify another bad decision. A person loses money and then takes an even greater risk because they want to recover it quickly. Someone experiences rejection and then enters an unhealthy relationship simply to prove they are desirable. Someone feels insecure about their body and spends beyond their means on products they hope will finally make them feel acceptable. This is the psychology of chasing, and chasing rarely creates freedom. A better principle is, do not let the desire to repair yesterday destroy tomorrow. If you made a financial mistake, stabilize first. If you made a relationship mistake, reflect first. If you experienced rejection, give yourself time before making major emotional decisions. If you are distressed about your body, seek reliable information rather than allowing shame to make the decisions for you. Pause. Recover. Learn. Then act. This is not weakness. It is strategic patience. Human sexuality also teaches us something important about the difference between private experience and social expectations. People can experience desires or fantasies that do not perfectly match the identity they present publicly. They may wonder what those experiences mean. Sometimes the answer is simply that human imagination is broad. A thought does not necessarily define a person. A fantasy does not necessarily predict behavior. A moment of curiosity does not necessarily require a permanent label. Self-understanding can take time. There is no requirement that every person immediately explain every aspect of their inner world, but there is also Value in examining recurring patterns when they cause distress. If a person repeatedly experiences anxiety, shame, compulsive behavior, or relationship problems connected with sexuality, professional support may be appropriate. Seeking help is not an admission of failure. It is an acknowledgement that some problems become easier to navigate when another trained person provides perspective. We often encourage people to see professionals for physical health without hesitation. Yet many people still feel embarrassed about seeking help for sexual or psychological concerns. That stigma can be harmful. Sexual health is part of health. Emotional well-being is part of health. Relationships influence well-being. Asking an appropriate professional a difficult question can be an act of responsibility. The same principle applies to money. If you do not understand taxes, seek appropriate guidance. If you have complex financial circumstances, consider qualified professional advice. If you do not understand an investment, learn before committing money. There is no prize for making complicated decisions alone. A financial principle I want you to remember is, confidence should come from understanding, not from pretending you already know. You do not need to become an expert in everything. You need to know what you understand, what you do not understand, and when to seek help. This is intellectual humility. It protects you from two dangerous extremes: helpless dependence and arrogant certainty. Helpless dependence says, I cannot understand this, so someone else must decide everything for me. Arrogant certainty says, I understand enough already, so I do not need to learn. Healthy judgment says, I will learn what I can, verify important information, and ask qualified people when I need specialized help. That approach works in relationships too. You may know your own feelings, but you cannot automatically know another person's. You may understand your own boundaries, but you cannot assume someone else's. You may have experience with one relationship, but that does not make you an expert on every relationship. Listen, ask, observe, learn, and allow other people to tell you who they are rather than forcing them into the category you expected. This becomes especially important when considering sexual orientation and gender. People can experience identity and attraction in diverse ways, and these experiences do not always fit simplistic categories. Social expectations can shape how comfortable people feel expressing themselves, and stigma can influence whether people disclose personal information. A respectful approach does not require you to understand every person's experience perfectly. It requires you to recognize that other people are entitled to dignity and autonomy. You do not have to have lived someone else's life to treat them respectfully. You do not have to share someone's identity to recognize their humanity. And you do not have to abandon your own beliefs in order to communicate without hostility. That is an important distinction. Respect is not identical to agreement. You can disagree while remaining civil. You can have personal values while recognizing another person's right to make personal decisions. A mature society requires that balance. The psychological benefit of this attitude is that it reduces the exhausting need to categorize everyone. When we insist that every person must fit neatly into our expectations, we spend enormous energy defending categories instead of understanding individuals. Curiosity creates more possibilities. Ask, what does this person actually experience? Rather than, what are people like that always like? That small change in language can transform conversations. It can also improve relationships because people feel seen as individuals rather than stereotypes. The same is true in long-term partnerships. One of the greatest dangers is assuming that you already know everything about someone simply because you have known them for years. Familiarity can create the illusion that there is nothing left to discover, but people continue to evolve. Their preferences change, their worries change, their dreams change, their bodies change, their priorities change. Keep asking questions. What are you looking forward to? What has been difficult lately? What do you need from me? What has changed for you? What are you afraid to talk about? These questions keep a relationship alive because they acknowledge that the person you love is not a static object. They are a moving, developing human being, and that leads to one of the most useful relationship principles. Do not fall in love only with who someone was. Keep learning who they are becoming. That principle requires attention. Attention is one of the most valuable things you can give another person. Not constant surveillance. Not control. Attention. Listen when they speak. Notice when something changes. Remember what matters to them. Ask about experiences you might otherwise overlook. Celebrate progress. Be willing to learn. The same principle applies to yourself. Do not become so attached to an old version of yourself that you refuse to recognize who you are becoming. Perhaps you once measured success by salary and now care more about time. Perhaps you once believed a relationship should look a certain way and now understand that compatibility matters more than appearances. Perhaps you once spent money to impress people and now prefer financial simplicity. Perhaps you once feared being alone and now recognize the value of independence. Growth often looks like changing your definition of success, and financial freedom can be part of that redefinition. Imagine reaching a point where your financial decisions are not primarily about appearing successful. You know what you need. You know what you value. You understand your obligations. You have a plan. You save where possible. You invest according to an informed strategy appropriate to your circumstances. You understand that markets involve risk. You avoid unnecessary debt when possible. You do not assume that a higher income automatically creates wealth. Then something changes psychologically. You stop asking, "Can I afford to impress them?" You start asking, "Does this purchase serve my goals?" You stop asking, "How can I become rich quickly?" You start asking, "How can I build sustainable financial resilience?" You stop asking, "What investment is everyone talking about?" You start asking, "Do I understand the risks?" Those questions may sound less exciting, but they are much more powerful. Financial freedom is usually built through boring consistency. Save. Invest thoughtfully. Control unnecessary expenses. Develop skills. Protect against major risks. Review the plan. Repeat. There may be no dramatic moment when you suddenly become financially free. Instead, there is a gradual accumulation of good decisions. The same is true of trust. Trust is built through consistency. A person keeps promises, communicates honestly. Respects boundaries, takes responsibility. Shows up. Over time, those behaviors create a psychological sense of safety, and safety can make intimacy possible. People are more likely to communicate honestly when they believe they will not be punished for telling the truth. They are more likely to express preferences when they know their boundaries will be respected. They are more likely to discuss difficulties when they believe the other person will listen rather than immediately attack. This does not mean relationships should avoid disagreement. Healthy relationships can contain conflict. The goal is not the absence of conflict. The goal is constructive conflict. There is a difference between saying, "I disagree with you," and saying, "You are worthless." There is a difference between expressing anger and using anger to intimidate. There is a difference between asking for reassurance and demanding constant proof. There is a difference between discussing a financial concern and using money as a weapon. There is a difference between negotiating intimacy and applying pressure. The behavior matters. That is why love alone cannot guarantee a healthy relationship. Love is powerful, but relationships also require skills. Communication. Respect. Negotiation. Self-awareness. Boundaries. Accountability. Empathy. And sometimes professional support. If a relationship repeatedly becomes harmful, simply saying, "But we love each other," does not resolve the underlying problem. Love is not permission to ignore harm. And independence is not permission to ignore responsibility. The healthiest relationships create room for both connection and autonomy. You can love someone without owning them. You can support someone without controlling them. You can desire someone without feeling entitled to them. You can disagree without humiliating them. You can have boundaries without being cruel. You can leave a relationship without declaring that the other person has no value. Those distinctions are signs of psychological maturity. They also create a healthier foundation for sexuality because intimacy becomes a choice rather than an obligation. and choice is essential. The word should causes enormous confusion in human relationships. You should want sex. You should want marriage. You should have children. You should be attracted to a particular type of person. You should earn a certain amount of money. You should own a house. You should look a certain way. You should be further ahead by now. But whose should is it? Sometimes, social expectations become so familiar that we mistake them for personal goals. So ask yourself, do I actually want this, or have I been trained to want it? That question can change a life. Maybe you discover that you genuinely want marriage. Wonderful. Build toward it. Maybe you discover that you want a different relationship structure. Then learn carefully about what that requires and whether it aligns with your values. Maybe you discover that you want financial independence more than luxury. Then structure your finances around freedom. Maybe you discover that you want a career with more meaning and less status. Then begin exploring what would make that possible. The goal is not to reject society. The goal is to become conscious of which expectations you choose to accept. Conscious choice is freedom, and once you become conscious of your choices, you become better equipped to handle their consequences. That is the mature side of autonomy. Freedom without responsibility can become chaos. Responsibility without freedom can become oppression. A healthy life requires both. This is why sexual education should not simply provide biological information. It should help people develop decision-making skills. It should teach people how to communicate, evaluate risk, recognize boundaries, understand diversity, and seek appropriate help. It should encourage critical thinking rather than fear. And the same philosophy applies to financial education. Do not merely tell people to save money. Teach them why. Explain opportunity cost, explain compound growth, explain risk, explain debt, explain emergency reserves, explain taxes and fees at an appropriate level. Explain that investing involves uncertainty. Explain that wealth building is generally a long-term process rather than a guaranteed shortcut. Education becomes powerful when it creates understanding rather than memorized slogans. So let me give you a principle that connects all of this. The goal of education is not to make you dependent on answers. It is to make you capable of asking better questions. Better questions protect you. What do I actually know? What am I assuming? What evidence supports this? What are the risks? Who benefits if I believe this? What does the other person want? Have they freely agreed? What happens if circumstances change? What choice gives my future self more freedom? Those questions can guide an entire life, and there will be times when you do not like the answer. Maybe the evidence contradicts something you believed. Maybe the relationship requires a difficult conversation. Maybe your finances require sacrifices. Maybe a boundary means accepting that someone will be disappointed. Maybe pursuing freedom requires walking away from an opportunity that looks attractive but creates too much risk. Courage is not always doing more. Sometimes courage is refusing to do what everyone else is doing. Sometimes courage is waiting. Sometimes courage is saying no. Sometimes courage is admitting that you were wrong. And sometimes courage is starting again. Never underestimate the power of starting again. A person who understands their mistake and changes course is not necessarily behind. They may actually be ahead of the person who refuses to. Examine their direction. You can change your financial habits. You can improve your communication. You can learn more about sexual health. You can challenge your assumptions. You can become more comfortable with your body. You can learn to establish boundaries. You can repair relationships where repair is possible. And where repair is not possible, you can learn to move forward. Your life does not require perfection. It requires participation. You have to participate in your own development. Nobody else can do all of it for you. Other people can teach. They can support. They can advise. They can love. But ultimately, you are responsible for deciding what kind of life you are going to build. So build deliberately. Let curiosity challenge assumptions. Let evidence challenge myths. Let communication replace guessing. Let consent replace entitlement. Let self-respect replace shame. Let financial planning replace financial avoidance. Let patience replace impulsiveness, and let long-term freedom become more important than short-term approval, because when you begin to understand the psychology behind your choices, you gain something more valuable than a collection of facts. You gain perspective. And perspective changes everything. You begin to realize that the person standing in front of you is not a stereotype. The relationship you are experiencing is not a movie. Your body is not a product. Your fantasies are not automatically your intentions. Your emotions are not always instructions. Your income is not your identity. Your possessions are not your worth, and your past is not a complete prediction of your future. You are a human being capable of learning, adapting, choosing, and growing. That may be the most important psychological insight of all. And once you accept it, the question changes. You stop asking, how do I become the perfect person? You start asking, how can I become a little wiser than I was yesterday? That is a goal you can actually live with, and it is a goal that can transform not only your relationships and sexuality, but the entire way you approach freedom, money, health, and life itself. By the time we reach the end of any serious conversation about human sexuality, one realization becomes impossible to ignore. There is no single sentence that can explain the human experience. We are biological beings, but biology is only part of the story. We are psychological beings, shaped by memory, emotion, learning, expectations, and imagination. We are social beings, influenced by family, friends, culture, media, institutions, and the people with whom we form relationships. And we are decision-making beings, capable of reflecting on our impulses and choosing how we want to respond to them. That combination is what makes sexuality both fascinating and complicated. It also means that the most useful education is not education that gives you a rigid list of rules. It is education that teaches you how to think, how to question, how to communicate, how to recognize boundaries, how to evaluate information, and how to make decisions that respect both yourself and other people. Perhaps the most important thing I would want you to take away is that understanding sexuality is ultimately an exercise in understanding human beings. When we talk about desire, we are talking about motivation. When we talk about attraction, we are talking about perception and emotion. When we talk about relationships, we are talking about attachment, communication, expectations, and cooperation. When we talk about sexual health, we are talking about responsibility and access to reliable information. When we talk about identity, we are talking about the ways people understand themselves within a social world. And when we talk about consent, we are talking about autonomy and respect. These subjects overlap constantly. You cannot always separate the psychological from the social, or the emotional from the physical, because human beings do not experience themselves in separate compartments. This is why I would encourage you to resist simple explanations. Simple explanations are attractive because they make uncertainty disappear. They tell us that men are one way, women are another way. Relationships work according to one formula, attraction follows one predictable pattern, and success can be achieved by following 5 easy rules. But reality is rarely that convenient. People differ, circumstances differ, cultures differ, relationships differ. Even the same person can change dramatically across different periods of life. A person who experiences strong desire during one period may experience something very different during another because of stress, health, relationship circumstances, medication, aging, or changing priorities. That variability is not evidence that human psychology has failed. It is evidence that human psychology is complex, and complexity should not frighten us. It should make us curious. Curiosity is one of the most valuable qualities you can develop because it allows you to approach unfamiliar experiences without immediately turning them into threats. When someone behaves differently from you, curiosity asks, what might explain this? Judgment asks, what's wrong with them? When a relationship changes, Curiosity asks, what has changed, and what do we need now? Panic asks, does this mean everything is falling apart? When your financial situation changes, curiosity asks, what caused this, and what can I adjust? Shame says, I have failed. The questions we ask determine the possibilities we can see. That is why I would leave you with this principle. A better question can be more valuable than a faster answer. If you are confused about your sexuality, ask questions rather than rushing toward a label simply because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. If you are concerned about a relationship, communicate rather than creating a story from incomplete information. If you are worried about your health, seek appropriate professional guidance rather than relying on frightening online speculation. If you are uncertain about your finances, examine the numbers rather than avoiding them. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, but ignorance is usually more expensive. The willingness to learn is a form of personal power. You do not need to know everything. You need to remain teachable. That distinction can protect you throughout adulthood. The world will change. New research will appear. Technology will change how people meet and communicate. Social expectations will evolve. Your own circumstances will change. The beliefs that seemed obvious at one age may look different later. A person who is committed to lifelong learning can adapt. A person who believes they already know everything becomes vulnerable to outdated assumptions. This principle has an obvious financial equivalent. The person who believes they have discovered the one guaranteed path to wealth is vulnerable to scams and overconfidence. Markets change. Careers change. Regulations change. Personal circumstances change. A strategy that was appropriate under one set of conditions may become inappropriate under another. Financial freedom therefore requires not only saving and investing, but continuing education and periodic reassessment. A useful financial principle is: build systems that can survive your changing circumstances. Do not build a financial life that works only when everything goes perfectly. If possible, maintain an emergency reserve. Avoid taking on obligations that leave you with no room for unexpected events. Diversify appropriately rather than assuming one opportunity will always work. Protect yourself against significant risks. Continue developing skills that can support your earning ability. Review your goals as your life changes. The purpose is not to predict the future perfectly. The purpose is to become harder to destabilize. That is what resilience means. Resilience is also important in relationships. A resilient relationship is not one in which nothing ever goes wrong. It is one in which people can respond to difficulties without destroying one another. Two people may disagree about money, family responsibilities, sex, career decisions, or personal boundaries. They may become angry. They may misunderstand one another. What matters is what they do next. Do they attack? Do they withdraw indefinitely? Do they manipulate? Do they threaten? Or do they attempt to understand, repair, negotiate, and establish a better way forward? Healthy relationships require repair because human beings are imperfect. You will misunderstand people. You will say things you wish you had said differently. You will sometimes fail to notice what another person needs. Other people will do the same to you. The goal is not to become someone who never makes mistakes. The goal is to become someone who can recognize mistakes and respond responsibly. An apology matters when it is connected to understanding. A boundary matters when it is communicated clearly. Forgiveness matters when it does not require pretending that harm never occurred. Trust matters when it is supported by consistent behavior, and love matters most when it is expressed through respect rather than possession. A person who understands their mistake and changes course is not necessarily behind. They may actually be ahead of the person who refuses to examine their direction. You can change your financial habits. You can improve your communication. You can learn more about sexual health. You can challenge your assumptions. You can become more comfortable with your body. You can learn to establish boundaries. You can repair relationships where repair is possible. And where repair is not possible, you can learn to move forward. Your life does not require perfection. It requires participation. You have to participate in your own development. Nobody else can do all of it for you. Other people can teach, they can support. They can advise, they can love, but ultimately, you are responsible for deciding what kind of life you are going to build. So build deliberately. Let curiosity challenge assumptions. Let evidence challenge myths. Let communication replace guessing. Let consent replace entitlement. Let self-respect replace shame. Let financial planning replace financial avoidance. Let patience replace impulsiveness. And let long-term freedom become more important than short-term approval. Because when you begin to understand the psychology behind your choices, you gain something more valuable than a collection of facts. You gain perspective. And perspective changes everything. You begin to realize that the person standing in front of you is not a stereotype. The relationship you are experiencing is not a movie. Your body is not a product. Your fantasies are not automatically your intentions. Your emotions are not always instructions. Your income is not your identity. Your possessions are not your worth, and your past is not a complete prediction of your future. You are a human being capable of learning, adapting, choosing, and growing. That may be the most important psychological insight of all. And once you accept it, the question changes. You stop asking, how do I become the perfect person? You start asking, how can I become a little wiser than I was yesterday? That is a goal you can actually live with, and it is a goal that can transform not only your relationships and sexuality, but the entire way you approach freedom, money, health, and life itself. By the time we reach the end of any serious conversation about human sexuality, one realization becomes impossible to ignore. There is no single sentence that can explain the human experience. We are biological beings, but biology is only part of the story. We are psychological beings, shaped by memory, emotion, learning, expectations, and imagination. We are social beings, influenced by family, friends, culture, media, institutions, and the people with whom we form relationships. And we are decision-making beings, capable of reflecting on our impulses and choosing how we want to respond to them. That combination is what makes sexuality both fascinating and complicated. It also means that the most useful education is not education that gives you a rigid list of rules. It is education that teaches you how to think, how to question, how to communicate, how to recognize boundaries, how to evaluate information, and how to make decisions that respect both yourself and other people. Perhaps the most important thing I would want you to take away is that understanding sexuality is ultimately an exercise in understanding human beings. When we talk about desire, we are talking about motivation. When we talk about attraction, we are talking about perception and emotion. When we talk about relationships, we are talking about attachment, communication, expectations, and cooperation. When we talk about sexual health, we are talking about responsibility and access to reliable information. When we talk about identity, we are talking about the ways people understand themselves within a social world. And when we talk about consent, we are talking about autonomy and respect. These subjects overlap constantly. You cannot always separate the psychological from the social, or the emotional from the physical, because human beings do not experience themselves in separate compartments. This is why I would encourage you to resist simple explanations. Simple explanations are attractive because they make uncertainty disappear. They tell us that men are one way, women are another way. Relationships work according to one formula, attraction follows one predictable pattern, and success can be achieved by following 5 easy rules. But reality is rarely that convenient. People differ, circumstances differ, cultures differ, relationships differ. Even the same person can change dramatically across different periods of life. A person who experiences strong desire during one period may experience something very different during another because of stress, health, relationship circumstances, medication, aging, or changing priorities. That variability is not evidence that human psychology has failed. It is evidence that human psychology is complex, and complexity should not frighten us. It should make us curious. Curiosity is one of the most valuable qualities you can develop because it allows you to approach unfamiliar experiences without immediately turning them into threats. When someone behaves differently from you, curiosity asks, "What might explain this?" Judgment asks, "What's wrong with them?" When a relationship changes, curiosity asks, "What has changed, and what do we need now?" Panic asks, "Does this mean everything is falling apart?" When your financial situation changes, curiosity asks, "What caused this, and what can I adjust?" Shame says, "I have failed." The questions we ask determine the possibilities we can see. That is why I would leave you with this principle. A better question can be more valuable than a faster answer. If you are confused about your sexuality, ask questions rather than rushing toward a label simply because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. If you are concerned about a relationship, communicate rather than creating a story from incomplete information. If you are worried about your health, seek appropriate professional guidance rather than relying on frightening online speculation. If you are uncertain about your finances, examine the numbers rather than avoiding them. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, but ignorance is usually more expensive. The willingness to learn is a form of personal power. You do not need to know everything. You need to remain teachable. That distinction can protect you throughout adulthood. The world will change. New research will appear. Technology will change how people meet and communicate. Social expectations will evolve. Your own circumstances will change. The beliefs that seemed obvious at one age may look different later. A person who is committed to lifelong learning can adapt. A person who believes they already know everything becomes vulnerable to outdated assumptions. This principle has an obvious financial equivalent. The person who believes they have discovered the one guaranteed path to wealth is vulnerable to scams and overconfidence. Markets change. Careers change. Regulations change. Personal circumstances change. A strategy that was appropriate under one set of conditions may become inappropriate under another. Financial freedom therefore requires not only saving and investing, but continuing education and periodic reassessment. A useful financial principle is: build systems that can survive your changing circumstances. Do not build a financial life that works only when everything goes perfectly. If possible, maintain an emergency reserve. Avoid taking on obligations that leave you with no room for unexpected events. Diversify appropriately rather than assuming one opportunity will always work. Protect yourself against significant risks. Continue developing skills that can support your earning ability. Review your goals as your life changes. The purpose is not to predict the future perfectly. The purpose is to become harder to destabilize. That is what resilience means. Resilience is also important in relationships. A resilient relationship is not one in which nothing ever goes wrong. It is one in which people can respond to difficulties without destroying one another. Two people may disagree about money, family responsibilities, sex, career decisions, or personal boundaries. They may become angry. They may misunderstand one another. What matters is what they do next. Do they attack? Do they withdraw indefinitely? Do they manipulate? Do they threaten? Or do they attempt to understand, repair, negotiate, and establish a better way forward? Healthy relationships require repair because human beings are imperfect. You will misunderstand people. You will say things you wish you had said differently. You will sometimes fail to notice what another person needs. Other people will do the same to you. The goal is not to become someone who never makes mistakes. The goal is to become someone who can recognize mistakes and respond responsibly. An apology matters when it is connected to understanding. A boundary matters when it is communicated clearly. Forgiveness matters when it does not require pretending that harm never occurred. Trust matters when it is supported by consistent behavior, and love matters most when it is expressed through respect rather than possession. There is a profound difference between intimacy and control. Intimacy says, "I want to know you." Control says, "I want to manage you." Intimacy makes room for another person's individuality. Control becomes threatened by it. Intimacy asks questions. Control demands answers. Intimacy respects privacy. Control treats privacy as suspicious. Intimacy can tolerate difference. Control tries to eliminate it. If you ever find yourself confusing control with care, stop and examine what is happening. Jealousy can be a real emotion, but an emotion does not automatically justify a behavior. Fear can be real, but fear does not automatically justify surveillance. Love can be real, but love does not automatically justify violating boundaries. The mature response is to acknowledge the emotion while taking responsibility for the behavior that follows. That is emotional freedom. And emotional freedom is connected to financial freedom in a surprisingly important way. Both involve increasing the distance between an immediate impulse and a long-term decision. Financial discipline asks you to tolerate the desire to spend so that you can pursue a larger goal. Emotional discipline asks you to tolerate the desire to react so that you can respond according to your values. In both cases, you are practicing delayed gratification. You are saying, "What I feel right now matters, but what I want my life to become matters too." That is a powerful sentence. What do you want your life to become? Not what would make strangers impressed. Not what would make social media look successful. Not what would satisfy a relative who has a particular definition of adulthood. Not what would make an insecure part of you feel temporarily superior. What do you actually want? Perhaps you want a loving partnership. Perhaps you want independence. Perhaps you want children. Perhaps you do not. Perhaps you want a demanding career. Perhaps you want more time and less status. Perhaps you want financial independence. Perhaps you want a simple life. Perhaps you want to travel. Perhaps you want to build a community. There is no universal blueprint for a meaningful life, but there should be conscious choices. If you never define success for yourself, someone else will define it for you. And when someone else defines it, you may spend years chasing a goal that was never truly yours. That is one reason financial freedom is so psychologically important. Money can become a scoreboard if you allow it to. You can spend your entire life trying to demonstrate that you are successful rather than asking whether your money is actually helping you live the life you value. A person may earn more, but have less time. They may own more, but experience more stress. They may have a prestigious title, but no freedom to say no. They may appear wealthy, but have enormous obligations. Another person may have less income, but substantial flexibility, manageable expenses, and strong relationships. Which person is richer? The answer depends on your definition of wealth. That is why I would phrase another principle this way. Wealth is not merely what you own. It is the range of choices your resources allow you to make. Money is one resource. Time is another. Health is another. Knowledge is another. Relationships are another. Reputation is another. Emotional stability is another. When you spend one resource, remember that you may be exchanging it for another. Working additional hours can produce income, but reduce time. Spending money can produce comfort, but reduce savings. Avoiding a difficult conversation can produce temporary peace, but increase long-term resentment. Saying yes to every request can preserve approval while exhausting your energy. Every choice has an opportunity cost. That is not merely a financial concept. It is a human one. You cannot say yes to everything. Your time is limited. Your attention is limited. Your energy is limited. Your money is limited. Your emotional capacity is limited. Freedom therefore includes learning what deserves your resources. This is why boundaries are not selfish. Boundaries help you allocate limited resources according to your values. A boundary says, "This is what I can give. This is what I cannot give. And this is how I need to be treated." Healthy boundaries do not require hostility. They require clarity. You can say no without insulting someone. You can decline without creating a courtroom argument. You can protect your time without believing that everyone else is unimportant. And other people are allowed to say no to you. That may disappoint you, but disappointment is part of life. One of the most important emotional skills is learning to tolerate disappointment without turning it into resentment. You will not always get what you want. Neither will anyone else. The mature question is, what can I do with the reality I have? That question can rescue you from endless battles with circumstances you cannot control. You cannot control whether another person is attracted to you. You cannot control whether someone wants a relationship with you. You cannot control every economic event. You cannot control what strangers think. You cannot control the passage of time. But you can control how you respond. You can improve your health habits. You can learn. You can communicate. You can save where possible. You can seek professional support. You can establish boundaries. You can develop skills. You can choose which relationships deserve your investment. You can decide what kind of person you want to become. This is where personal responsibility becomes empowering rather than punitive. Responsibility does not mean blaming yourself for everything that happens. It means identifying the parts of the situation over which you have influence and acting on them. There are circumstances you did not choose. There are disadvantages you did not create. There are events you cannot prevent. But even in difficult circumstances, there may be choices available. Find them, develop them, protect them, and if your options are limited, seek support rather than pretending that determination alone can solve every structural problem. Compassion and responsibility can coexist. We should encourage people to take ownership without pretending that everyone begins from the same starting line. The same balanced thinking is necessary when discussing sexual health. Individual behavior matters, but access to health care, education, social stigma, economic conditions, and cultural context can also influence health outcomes. A responsible approach recognizes both personal agency and broader circumstances. This is why education should never be used simply to frighten people. Fear can change behavior temporarily. Understanding can change behavior sustainably. If people understand why a particular health practice matters, they are more likely to make informed decisions. If they understand how consent works, they can communicate more effectively. If they understand that sexual experiences vary, they may be less likely to panic when their lives do not match unrealistic expectations. If they understand how psychological factors influence desire, they may approach relationship difficulties with more patience. Knowledge replaces unnecessary fear with informed action. And informed action is one of the foundations of freedom. Think about the number of decisions you make every day based on assumptions you inherited. You may have inherited beliefs about masculinity, femininity, marriage, money, success, attractiveness, aging, or what a normal life should look like. Some of those beliefs may serve you, others may not. You do not have to reject every inherited belief, but you should examine them. Ask, is this actually true? Where did I learn it? Does the evidence support it? Does it help me? Does it harm anyone? Do I still believe it because it makes sense, or simply because it is familiar? That last question can be uncomfortable. Familiarity has enormous psychological power. We often defend familiar ideas because changing them would require admitting that we were mistaken. But changing your mind is not intellectual weakness. It is evidence that new information has reached you. You are allowed to say, I used to think differently. In fact, I hope you can. Because growth means that your future self knows things your present self does not. The same applies to relationships. You are allowed to learn that a communication style you once used was ineffective. You are allowed to recognize that a relationship pattern was unhealthy. You are allowed to become better at listening. You are allowed to learn that your assumptions about another person's needs were incorrect, and you are allowed to repair. Repair does not guarantee reconciliation. Sometimes a relationship can be repaired. Sometimes the healthiest choice is separation. The important thing is to make that decision with awareness rather than fear. A person should not remain in a harmful situation simply because leaving feels financially difficult. A person should not remain because society says they have failed. A person should not remain because they are afraid of being alone. At the same time, a person should not abandon a relationship simply because it has entered a difficult period. Relationships require effort. The key is to distinguish ordinary difficulty from persistent harm. That distinction is not always easy. When uncertainty is high, professional counseling can provide perspective. There is no shame in seeking help. In fact, asking for help can be one of the clearest signs that you take your life seriously. The same is true with finances. A qualified professional can sometimes help you see options you did not recognize. But remember that expertise should be evaluated too. Ask about qualifications. Understand potential conflicts of interest. Be cautious of guarantees. Be wary of anyone who promises effortless wealth, secret formulas, or risk-free returns.